There's no beauty here, only death and decay.
Welcome to The Beauty of Horror, a podcast dedicated to exploring the unsettling beauty found within our favorite genre. Each episode, I will sit down with a different guest to discuss a horror film they find particularly beautiful and why. I'm your host, Chandler Bullock, and today's guest is a horror writer, scholar, and speaker. You can find their written work on CineSpeak, the upcoming book entitled Transploitation, and their account on Medium. They will also be seen in the upcoming mental health and horror documentary, so definitely check that out. They are both a Beauty of Horror alum from Season 1 and a very good friend of mine, so it's my pleasure to give beautiful greetings to Dani Bethea.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back on the show, and I'm so delighted that you asked to have me back, Chandler.
Oh, it was no question in my mind. Immediately, Season 2 was like, oh, I got to get Dani back on. I mean, I had so much fun with our first episode that we discussed the double feature of Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone, which was just a very rich discussion. And I was really happy when we found a way to do things a little experimentally this season as well, which we'll get into a little bit later. But thank you so much for being back on. Before we begin our discussion, I do like to kick off each episode with a quote that I feel relates to the topic. This can be from philosophy, filmmakers, or elsewhere in the interwebs, basically. And today's quote is as follows. Beauty as an objective property of things is apprehended through the delight we take in simply knowing them as they are. It is primarily by means of the senses of sight and hearing that we become acquainted with objects in their individuality and derive a spontaneous pleasure in our encounter with them. I will reveal who said this a little bit later. But first, Dani, welcome back, of course. And, in Season 1, we briefly discussed how you got into horror and what the genre means to you. So the only question I can think up at the moment for a repeat is, what keeps you coming back then? I know, horror falls into what a lot of people call genre filmmaking, that wide umbrella of science fiction, fantasy, and horror tend to kind of go together. And I know that you are into a pretty wide range of storytelling as well, but is there something about horror that kind of keeps you coming back to it more often?
What, in recent years, and I think I've written about this in a lot of my pieces, is the catharsis that I find in the genre. The storytelling that happens there that frequently doesn't happen in other genres of film. And obviously, the film we're going to get into a little bit later on is an intertwined horror historical piece. And more than anything, I enjoy the genre because it's always treading new ground and kind of plotting new territory as the decades have gone by. That the genre seems like it's a space, at least in my personal opinion, that doesn't really have any reins on it per se, that between, sure, you have your big studio releases, but you also have, your smaller film festival platforms, indie places to watch films. Shudder. Kind of like the space is wide open, and it seems like it's growing all the time, and it's a community like no place else, to be honest. You'll find every age, race, gender that you can think of that loves horror. It's such an open space, truly.
That's a great way to put that open space. It's true that when I see the different pockets and communities you can get with, say, anime, science fiction, and other genres, that although, of course, you always have a portion where people will like things for different reasons, so you can discuss your love of something with somebody else and share a feeling, but you might actually be talking about something entirely different on a detail level. I have noticed that with horror, it does seem to be that kind of open space and open book in terms of this gradient of ideologies and sensibilities that kind of permeate within it, probably due to how the genre expresses and portrays these different types of viewpoints, basically. And I think that might be a thing there, that it's a genre that doesn't shy away from anything, as you're saying. I like that you put it. There's no reins on it. And I have to wholeheartedly agree with that. And so you mentioned that you've written about the catharsis of horror. Then is there any film out there, or a couple films maybe even, that you find particularly cathartic, and perhaps we can explore maybe the reasons for that?
I know I've written frequently about Beloved as a film and even as a text. Not directed by a woman, but what the film explores into from Toni Morrison's text is really like deep. If you're not familiar with it, or for the listeners, it's a ghost story. It's a historical piece. It's post slavery North America. A woman who was forced to do something tragic and terrible so that her daughter wouldn't experience the horrors of enslavement, but the ghost of the child, comes back to haunt her and the entire family. It's really deep. I don't want to get into it any more than that, but an amazing film that is getting quite a resurgence of eyes recently, which I greatly appreciate. In the book, obviously, even more so, Toni Morrison's like profound hand in writing. I would say the next film, which actually came out the year I was born, ironically enough, is Jacob's Ladder, which I've written about as well. I love films that, if you watch Jacob's Ladder as well, you'll also find that it's an anti-war piece, that it's a mental health piece, that it's working on so many kind of different levels that every time I kind of watch it or rewatch it or read someone's view on it, that there's something more and more profound about it. And I even wrote a piece, I think it was called 30 years later, Jacob's Ladder, like the Jacob's Ladder generation, that so many of us, similar to the main character, are dealing with being young people in the time of an ongoing war. Like, it seems like a never-ending war, right? That our country is trying to perpetrate and reel young people into a killing machine that we don't want to be a part of, and thinking that people will be okay when they come back and try to quote unquote assimilate back into the real world, and you've been exposed to a surreal world. So that's what I love about the film. It's this overlapping, just roller coaster, really. It's a drug trip for sure. So.
Oh yeah, yes, it is. I mean, it's influenced a lot of other films and games and media as well, due to the visuals, as you say, the drug trippiness of it. Yeah, but as you're pointing out, the purpose of it all is indeed to give you that unease and that feeling of questioning, what does reality even mean? Especially when you have been fed an alternative reality all the time, basically. It's a very interesting reading for that, and I really appreciate that. And what I really appreciate here is we're getting to explore a bit more about how broadly horror addresses topics. Since, and I mentioned this in the previous episode when I was talking with Joe Lipset, that we also talked about how horror just seems to be the only genre, or at the very least one of the few genres, that just welcomes in all the other genres with it. And, it can either assimilate, or it can also just be a good companion to another genre's sensibilities, so that you can have a good drama mixed in with a horror tale. You can have a good comedy, so on and so forth. And in this case, that means that you can address a lot of things that are pretty profound, and it not be what most people, I guess, would say is like base horror, or, whatever the mainstream idea of the genre would be, which of course is usually just very basically 80 slashers is kind of what it boils down to for a lot of people, is that it's always lighthearted and bloody and nasty, and we just revel in the excess. And of course we do. That's really fun to do. But there's way more to what it's capable of and what the genre is used for. So I'm really happy to hear some more titles there that do that. In fact, kind of like the title we're going to talk about today, if I may say so. A little segue there. I feel that we're kind of already touching upon it just a little bit. So please introduce to everyone what film we're talking about today.
Gojira 1954.
Ah, the OG Big G, yes. From Ishirō Honda, fantastic film. I'm super excited when you brought this up. And so the little bit of the experiment, I'll just already tell people now before we get into this, so you can be really excited for this, since we are breaking the season up into the 4 different aesthetic categories that I've chosen. You had the wonderful idea, instead of doing a double feature of this with Shin Godzilla, which would give a great contrast in comparison of how they explore the political landscape and the response to the situation, instead of doing a double feature for this one episode, we could approach them from different aesthetics and see how that affects our reading of them. So we're going to come back to that during the grotesque. So somewhere around the end of the run, Dani will be back, and we will be following it up with the kind of reboot of this whole franchise for the modern era. But first, we're going to get into the 1954 film, and we're going to first give a brief synopsis for anybody who hasn't seen it, which, I mean, if you haven't, come on. I know you can watch the MonsterVerse stuff, but know where it comes from, and you'll really understand what those movies are going for as well. To keep things simple, I actually want to see how well IMDb is doing with their synopses and see after our discussions if we feel they've even remotely told you what a film is about. So their synopsis says, an American nuclear weapons testing results in the creation of a seemingly unstoppable dinosaur-like beast. That is accurate, but I think there's more. And I can't wait to dig into that. So when I approached you for this and said, hey, I want to bring you back on, you can pick any aesthetic that you want, Godzilla was really quick. I think we also discussed this a little bit on Twitter, and that's where it kind of sparked it. But what made you want to talk about this movie on a podcast?
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, I don't think I ever have had the opportunity before. And there have been other podcasts where I see people get to like gush and fawn all over it for a myriad of reasons. And I was just like, I need to do that too. So
yeah, I'm happy you did. I haven't gotten to talk about it yet either. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm delighted, and I really can't wait to talk about, honestly, to me, they feel like bookends, which they're meant to be, in my opinion. Gojira and Shin Gojira in the almost 2020s. Wow, that's crazy. But they have this tether between the two that is unignorable, and what each film is doing from a horror history perspective is truly undeniable and incredible, and it's like totally my jam. So like a lot of horror I like to write about, or even sometimes things I like to explore, is from a horror history perspective. And little baby Dani, like when I found out that there was a film that actually went into the horrors of World War II, nuclear warfare, but like had a sci-fi horror slant on it, I was just, I ran to see it immediately. Not the American one, not the, and I'm sure we'll get there, but yeah, the original.
Yeah. There's a very specific reason, you're using Gojira, which I will do that as well. It's the Japanese version that we're talking about for everybody, because there is a very distinct difference between the American take on it. It's the same film, essentially, but they did add some things to it to Americanize it. It's not just voiceovers the way most of the later installments in the franchise did. And so you said that so did you see this at a young age then, for the first time?
I did. I honestly can't remember when. It's odd being young when you see things. You remember it. Like your body remembers, your mind remembers, but could you put a date on it or a month on it? You just remember it.
Fair enough. Yeah. So do you remember, was it like on television that you saw it for the first time, or did you actually try to find like a copy of it in the rental stores or something?
I may have seen it, on one of maybe a couple platforms. So I may have seen it on Svengoolie.
Oh, cool.
I may have seen it on Turner Classic Movies, or so this is we're of a certain age, so like after a certain time at night, you remember like TV used to kind of go off. Like TV used to like cut off, or like it used to go straight to infomercials.
Yeah.
But I can't remember even if it was just on some obscure channel at night, Mm-hmm. So it was one of those three, but it was one of those three that tried to, I think, get an original copy of the film that like added context, so on and so forth.
All right. Okay. Yeah. And there's a lot of options there as well. I mean, yeah, when I was growing up, they had so many channels pick this movie up. The older they get, the easier it is. The rights become cheaper and cheaper, I suppose. I think I caught it on Sci-Fi, but when I was in high school. Mm-hmm, so yeah, I was a bit older when I saw this particular film. I was a huge Godzilla fan as a kid, so I had the toys. I had seen some of the later films in color. When we already had all the the villain of the episode, basically, kind of movies that they were making. And so for me, I think it wasn't until I was a bit older that my mom finally just told me, like, well, the original is a much scarier film. Like, what? Godzilla's scary? He's a hero. And then she's like, okay, hold on. Well, if you ever see it, you need to let me know. And as Sci-Fi did very often, they did a lot of movie marathons, and they did a Godzilla marathon for as many of the movies they could get the rights to. And I think this one was always pretty easy to get the rights to. So, yeah, I finally got to see it. But it's not really... It's recent memory that I hold on to with this movie. I don't think I really paid too much attention to it when it was on TV back in the day. Probably because the quality of televisions at the time.
Yeah.
Any older movie, they don't really work on those TVs, do they?
Well, it's interesting because at least the aspect ratio was correct for the TVs back then. So
fair. That's fair. Like, you at least got a full screen experience when you watch them. Yeah. So it was lost on me until I was an adult, really, just how dark this movie really, truly is. And quite a poignant message behind it as well. You were talking about already that it's this kind of sci-fi take on the horrors of World War II, and of course, more specifically, the bombings that took place in Japan. I want to talk a little bit then about how they've crafted the film. I think what's really interesting to me, compared to a lot of the other Godzilla films, and of course any of the American Godzilla films, is that Gojira really sets itself up from the moment it starts as this force of nature.
Yes.
Without any bells and whistles. It just kind of quietly reminds you of what it's like when nature does terrible things.
Absolutely. Rewatching it again last night, I was struck, like you said, like once again with how quietly this film starts. And it starts very quietly, no loud music, no kind of fanfare, how like now in, credits and things, we get something flying or whooshing or blowing out of the screen. Like it's obviously it's a film from the 50s, but the tone that it starts with is very serious. And it starts with the sound of a loud boom. And if you're not familiar with what the boom is, you're like, what on earth is that? So it already is quite unsettling about what this booming sound is. And then you hear this unfathomable, I hate to call it a roar, because it's right. To condense it to just a roar is like making small of like what Gojira is. So yeah, something that the human ear just kind of tries to comprehend.
That's a great way to put that. It's a very eerie sound. I mean, yeah, it is the most, the very iconic Godzilla roar that we know and love. Mm-hmm. Even actually before the one that we're kind of more accustomed to be honest. And there's just something so raw about it here. And I can only imagine that if you were part of a Japanese audience at the time, seeing this for the first time, and you don't know that this movie is going to be focusing so much on the bombings in World War II, that I can imagine that elicits something, hearing the boom, boom, and this undescribable, horrible sound. That thought always hits me when this movie starts, of just, what was it like in 1954 Japan to be in that crowd, to hear that before this movie even started? Thinking you're like, it's the Big Lizard movie, right?
Right, absolutely. And gradually the iconic score by Akira Ifukube starts in the background and gradually pulls us into the film. So already you have like a whole bunch of layers happening. You have footsteps, you have an ominous sounding screeching roar and the score, and then it fades into a scene that was based on some very, very real history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't dive too much into that, but I was checking my Blu-ray. I have the Criterion set for the Showa era Godzillas, and they did have a piece on that. But I briefly saw what it was, but there was indeed a disaster on a ship that seemed to have been the main inspiration from this. Do you know more about it that you can explain?
Yes, absolutely. So the Lucky Dragon number 5 fishing vessel was drifting in maritime waters in the Pacific, and actually received the brunt of an atomic blast. Frighteningly, the members aboard, talked about the flash, which is eerily reminiscent to what you actually see in the film. But in real life, they actually, saw the ash falling from the sky. They were covered in it. Not immediately, but gradually they started to have and feel the effects of radiation sickness. And the fact that this is where the film starts is letting you know that, like, it's firing on all cylinders with Japanese cultural, like, history. So it's starting from a very real place. The fact that the ship still actually exists. It's in a museum, as a matter of fact. Okay. And there's actually a documentary about the event, if any of the listeners are curious about it.
It sounds like a very haunting situation. The movie obviously would be just a mind-boggling thing to experience, considering the not supernatural, but I guess the extra fantastical element that you slap on top of it with things that they must have seen. But just hearing the real world version of it, it gives me chills just thinking about it. I can only imagine what it's like to see that ship and know what was going on there. So yeah, I definitely personally want to, find out more and see some documentaries on this. And you're right that it starts this film, even without that prior knowledge, you feel it a bit. It doesn't feel like this was just plucked out of air for entertainment. This moment has a lot of weight to it and feels indicative of something else. And it's just it was already a quiet opening, and then you get a very disquieting hit right after that. That somehow you get more quiet watching the film. It's such a gut punch, and the movie doesn't really let up from that point on. It is quite interesting to see how this franchise developed over time and the tone shifts that it underwent. Yeah, totally. When you see these origins, it's very interesting to me. You've already touched upon one thing that I think let's start there when we're talking about aesthetics. Then something that we don't talk about a lot, and honestly, even on this podcast, I've only really broached the topic kind of gently, and that would be the music, because the score to this movie, not only is it just legendary, and most people, if they hear it, they're like, I've heard that before. You know it. It's a very famous just theme. but it's also sparse. And I love that. That when it's there, it matters.
Totally. That it's got kind of two main themes. Like everybody obviously knows like kind of the Gojira theme, if you will.
Yeah.
And then may kind of sort of know the triumphant, all hands on deck, it's time for war theme, kind of happy plucky kind of theme. But it's so interesting that the Gojira's theme has been used for all kinds of different things. I remember when I was a little kid, like I can't remember what the song is, but I do know like it was like a hip hop track that used like the iconic dun 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 dun, that part, like it used that in a sample. And I remember just kind of thinking back, I was like, wait a minute, that was the song that used this as a sample. Like,
that's cool.
Yeah. I wish I could remember what the song was.
Well, you know, maybe afterwards, if you figure it out, then I can always put it in the show notes. So in case we don't mention it here on the show, check out the show notes, and maybe we can get you everybody like a YouTube clip or something to check out this track that you're mentioning. But that does show the testament of Akira Ifukube's score here. It's calculated, it's powerful, and it really showcases the might and grandeur behind the beast, basically. Which kind of brings the question then, what is the beast in this film? I love that this film takes far more time to explore the human response to it than it does about indulging in the science fiction of it all.
Right. That I really love that this film started to get into some like really cool nerd stuff, if you will. Like if you love like dinosaurs, or if you love, you know, paleontology or archaeology or whatever, like this is also, I guess, the film for you. And I guess maybe people who are more inclined / have taken biology more recently than I have could tell me if this film is correct with when it starts to break down where Gojira came from, the specific, you know, period. Was the Jurassic period correct? Like, was it, you know, did they get all of that kind of stuff right and accurate?
Right.
So,
yeah, I love it. Got real. That's the stuff I think that makes children really latch on to it. Even if you see, because you would think that, like myself, it's probably something like Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla that would really get kids really latching on and staying. But even Gojira has enough in there of this whimsy and wonder about just the world, the science of our planet and how we exist, that it keeps you locked in, and it always seems to light that portion of your brain up. Even now, at the wonderful age of 34, I'm watching it and just going, wow, yeah, tell me more. You know, when the professor's up there and then telling everybody about the links that they've made. And they're all very sound. I appreciate this. Nowadays, we have had so much science fiction that it's kind of hard to get away from the science that we know really well. And then you have to complicate it to a degree that it's actually really hard to follow. And I loved here that you could just see that, yeah, that all makes sense based on the very limited amount of archaeological or paleontological knowledge we might have. So. Yeah,
totally. I appreciate that this film was incorporating so much into its story. And actually, maybe if we rewind just a little bit back to the beginning, after the fishing vessel experiences Gojira's first appearance, we actually don't see Gojira I don't think we see Gojira until like the 15-minute mark or the 22-minute mark, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
But what I loved is that this film started very small. Like, it started in the fishing villages, like different islands, like far away from like the big cities and everything else. That it started with smaller communities who, and I really love this component that the elder, you know, some of the elder characters knew of Gojira's existence for a long time. And even there was this spiritual, shamanistic element, you know, that was introduced, that like they knew of this ancient creature that lived amongst them for generations and generations, but whether the people like on the mainland knew of it, obviously they didn't, but the people, far removed from, kind of wider Japanese, society and culture and everything, like revered this ancient being. Like I really loved some of those elements when I rewatched it. I was like, whoa, I did not pick up on this.
I always love that part, especially when they're doing the dances and you have the old man explain how, hey, these rituals used to be a lot more barbaric because we were very scared and we knew that it was real. But as time goes by, of course, especially smaller areas that kind of like to hold on to superstition and traditions, you may not completely lose it, but you do have the outside world try to stamp it out just a little bit. And I liked that there was this sort of divide there where the younger generations weren't at all going, oh, well, it's not this god. They're like, could be. I don't know. I don't necessarily believe, but we're going to do the ritual now because we're scared. This is what we have because we've lost our livestock. We've lost a lot of other things. And that was no typhoon, basically, is what they're saying.
Right.
So it's interesting you bring it up this way because the question I've had in my mind as well is the movie really, or at least for your feeling and my own, I'll give my own opinions on this. If the film is trying to say indeed that the belief is exactly what this creature is, or if it's like a convenient thing that they had a belief of a particular deity that matches the might and location of this particular animal. So I'm very curious how you feel on that, because if I read correctly the way you've described it so far, you would then feel that this is what they were talking about. Like they had a feeling it's down there. They've seen signs over hundreds of years, correct?
I'm always of the opinion and the belief that whenever elders speak of something, it has a root somewhere. Like it doesn't, like something that the elders have seen, witnessed, or experienced is something real, whether it's an ancient, prehistoric creature or not, or some type of folk tale that's kind of grown and, maybe spun a little out of control for the young people. But I feel like it's never good, right, to diminish what your elders are trying to say or what their experiences is, because there's some kind of truth there. And the fun part, or even like the cathartic part for the younger generations, is finding out like, well, what did they see, or what was going on in their lives that they have this, obviously this clinging on to something, obviously horrific happened and it's stuck. Like, so there's obviously generational trauma attached to Gojira, which I think is even more like impactful, that the mainland has no clue about, right? And that I love that in the film, even Gojira just shows up on the island sometimes. Like just shows up around the island, like makes its presence known.
I do like that, especially in just broad daylight. It just peeks over this hill. It's like, hey, what are y'all doing over there? You're making a lot of noise. It just leaves.
Right.
Shows just like, oh, wow, okay. I guess it adds that reality of this thing is here. It's not going anywhere. And it is just kind of acting like an animal, just going where sounds are taking it. So I have two things based on what you were saying about, communicating with elders and their beliefs. And I agree with you that questioning it, I like how you put it, it's not fun, but it's also not respectful. And there's plenty to learn from these stories. So I guess what I was getting at, it was more in a story world kind of way of like, if you feel that particular creature may have been literally what they were kind of thinking of, or maybe they had other reasons in their past that led to that story. And then, of course, I love that you bring up the generational trauma, because that is where we get into, if it is the latter, why you can easily just apply it to this. Because regardless of what real world thing, whether it's just bubbles in the water, or, there could have been some sort of fissure that created from a volcano underneath the sea. regardless of what that was, this is what it is now. This is what Gojira has become, and it applies perfectly. So the reason I find it so interesting to talk about the generational trauma a bit is because you also mentioned the mainland and how they have a completely different feeling with Gojira. They even say in the whole press, it's not even with the press, I suppose. It's when they're on television going over all their notes from the islands, and the professor says, I'm just going to use the name that the fishermen use. This is, what the locals on the island have called it, and I'm going to respect that. This is Gojira, because it is, basically, is how he's understood it. What I think is really interesting what the film does is show this generational trauma both from the islanders' perspective and in the mainland, because we do have the war and we do have the bombs. And that is immediately addressed the moment that they take us to... Is it Tokyo? Do they actually address what city it is that they are in?
I can't recall.
I was trying to check that out this time.
I wouldn't be surprised, though.
Well, let's say fictional Tokyo then, I suppose, but I'll just refer to it as Tokyo. And the moment they show the city, they have people who are commuting, hearing about it on the news. And one girl even says, I barely survived Nagasaki.
Yes.
So I'm really unhappy with this. It's the first thing they say.
That punched me in the gut, because I was thinking about, okay, she's very young, right? Young looking. So that I can only assume that she was a young girl or a very young child when she experienced that. And the way she just kind of said it so offhandedly.
Yeah.
Was like, oh.
Which is so... Now that we are... And I know, listeners, we're in 2021. I know you're tired of hearing people talk about the pandemic, but it is topical, so I do apologize. But I'm going to bring it up because it is a current event, and it is shaping our world. And the way this girl on this tram, metro, it wasn't too clear, subway car that they're on, addressed this is... kind of similar how I hear a lot of younger people address the pandemic we're in right now, or how people our generation might refer to 9/11 in response to the pandemic. And it was very interesting and eye-opening for me, because here we are 50, 60 years down the road. Oh my God, no, what am I saying? 70 years down the road. And it's the same, right? People don't necessarily change just because the times do. And I think it's wonderful to look back on these older films to see how people are responding to historical events from our perspective, of course, because it helps you contextualize events that are going on in your world and responses people are having in your world, which I guess is one reason we're going to do this kind of split double feature. Really shows that off. But it was just incredible to me how flippantly she talked about it, because I'm so used to seeing films from the 50s and 40s. Everybody has a sense of harrowing emotions and big and about something like this. And she was just kind of like, I didn't survive Nagasaki to have this shit happen to me right now. Basically, she really wanted to go home and get a latte.
Yeah, it's really incredible how trauma can last forever, but at the same time be very kind of situated, I guess, in a place and time that, as the younger generations move further and further away from the initial incident, less and less kind of gravitas and emotional hold it has on the younger generations. There's even different news reports and studies and everything else that a lot of young people in Japan have no frame of reference. Right. That there were even atomic bombings, that there were people who survived it.
Wow.
That there was or is, I don't know if it's still ongoing, but a campaign to kind of, I'm not going to say, I don't know if I necessarily want to say silence, but definitely it felt like silencing people who experienced it, people who have the scars of the atomic burns. They're called the hibakusha. They still talk about what happened to them, the fact that there are still survivors. Many are very old, so I guess I would say our grandparents or our great grandparents' ages, depending on how old you are. But yeah, the fact that this is like a through line that even still has like its like kind of impact and, you know, implications today, and the fact that when we're going to get into this later on, but I have to bring this up. Like when we talk about Shin Gojira, the fact that Shin as a character just exploded in like popularity again in Japan as a character, like as a fixture, as like cute plushes and toys and like amusement park rides, and like it's crazy. I mean, I'd love to go to Japan for that alone, because it's intense, like the love for the newest iteration of Gojira. And I think there's something profound about that, and probably the younger generations being like, well, let's go online and find out like why or how, or start asking questions.
Right. I love that that's a way that film can be used to help educate in the world, you know, because not only are you going to want to see, hey, where did this whole franchise come from, and this big fandom, this big boom, what's going on? Oh, that thing, okay. I remember that. My parents loved that, but why? They'll explore that, but then, of course, you're going to see the film and say, like, this feels kind of foreign to me. Why? And then you look up all the details of what actually happened and learn a bit about it a bit better. I love that film can do that. And I love that horror does this a lot, especially these types of horror films that like to address real-world issues in the narratives that they're putting together as fantastically as they put them out there, especially in this particular case. So there's a beautiful thing right there. The fact that there is a timelessness to our experiences of cinema to a certain degree. Obviously, there's always a context that can only be felt in the moment when something is released or when it's topical to a situation. But I will say that being my age, being born in 1987 and so far detached from all of this, I can still feel the emotions of those echoes that were left behind, because the people who've made this movie put a lot of that into it through the score, through the sounds of all these. I think they have a children's choir that's singing through a lot of it. And just through being able to see how the world existed at the time. Not just how buildings were and how people dressed and stuff, but really, how did they speak to each other? How did they get their information? And how did this shape their responses to situations like this? So, yeah, very interesting. You kind of sparked that with that comment just now.
Yeah, this film upon rewatch, like for 1954, and obviously there are cultural issues we have to take into account, but there were some different things I noticed in this film that were really probably pushing some like boundaries and taboos in Japanese society about those who were pushing against maybe spiritualism, pushing against capitalism, pushing against, you know, the new mechanized Japan in that aspect. When the press conference is going on and hearing, you know, the women use their voices and shouting and saying like, no, like we need to tell everyone about this. Like we need the truth, like tell the truth, like to hear, you know, these women just jumping up and shouting, and it's framed very intentionally, I think, that usually, you know, films didn't have like the luxury of just like cutting and editing, like things were filmed like very intentionally.
Right.
That to frame obviously these women surrounded by this like these panels of kind of men and everything, and to make sure that the camera is on them, right? And to show them like jumping up and shouting, like, you know, that hearing the professor's diagnosis of Gojira and what's happening and the danger that, you know, Gojira potentially poses, and for them to already like be on board with the science, be on board with the truth telling, and like not, you know, trying to cover this up or make it go away. But like it's powerful, because I think about like how many communities obviously would be vulnerable like once as we've already seen, right? Gojira, he mentioned that kind of offhanded comment that they used to throw like village maidens to Gojira to for sacrifice. Like, like.
So back to real quick to the scene in the press conference. Yeah, I really the way they just broke out of like, no, don't you dare, don't you start this shit.
Yes.
Is basically what these women are doing.
Yes.
Because this guy's trying really hard to push like we shouldn't tell anybody because they're going to panic, but we already know why he doesn't want people to know about it, and he finally has to push and come clean and like because let's face it, we're going to have really poor relations with America if we were to blame them for the H-bomb for all this. And you get that really nasty, like, is this really a political thing or is it a capitalist thing? And you get your answers later. A lot of the later films in the franchise, especially in the Showa era, make that a little more blatant. You know, they get more archetypical depictions of capitalism and the sleazy people who try to make all of these theme parks and stuff. But I love here that they just very subtly kind of show how the government thinks this way, in that most of the little breadcrumbs that we get of information of the concerns, most of the men that you have in their little lab coats and their suits and stuff keep mentioning things like, oh, the economy is going to crumble. How are we going? We have to fix this now because we have to shut down international trade. That's all they care about. They're not really thinking about protecting their citizens. And to the professor's point, Professor Tanabe, he thinks this is a golden opportunity to study a new life form that managed to survive mass amounts of radioactivity, which could protect them if another war were to ever break out. It's, and I love that they use the voice of women to broach that initially in the film. I also don't know if they ever address the roles of anybody there apart from the professor. So I love the chaos of it all. Like, I don't even know if these people were just citizens who were just there who had enough. I have no idea what was going on there. But I do love the intensity of that scene. We also see this a lot with the character of Emiko, how she has to basically be the middle point between three different ideologies on this whole issue, and therefore has the most complex development throughout the entire film. Poor girl, she does not have a good time during this film. She's got the brunt of burden for a lot of different things, and I felt really bad for Emiko throughout the entire thing.
Yeah, she's such an interesting character because, like you mentioned, the way she is positioned, that there's like a tug of war going on between like kind of duty, tradition, in this new Japan that's like on the horizon, right?
Yeah.
Where women will have more agency, where women will have like more voice in their own choices. And you kind of saw that, like glimmers of that throughout the film, that, you know, it was initially like an arranged marriage situation going on, but she didn't love who her intended was supposed to be, that she, you know, was going to find love and happiness like elsewhere. Like, I think that was like really powerful to see that she cared for him very deeply, but like to, you know, sacrifice herself in a loveless marriage just was not where her head was, or where, you know, young people were beginning to think, you know?
Yeah, I imagine that's where a lot of that taboo you were talking about was really going to come from in this movie at the time. I would say honestly, any movie from the 1950s to have a topic like that is already touching on territory that we're going to make any audience pretty uncomfortable. But then for the East, even more so, where they do have more honor and tradition, and you know, the respect of your elders goes to a degree that you just do what they want of you, basically. Whereas, you know, in America, things were, I guess, you know, we had prohibition that kind of screwed up a lot. Kind of made people go a little insane in that regard. At least nice and quickly. You know, we broke the bonds a little earlier, but through different means. I quite liked how the story, though, it breaks borders to an extent, because it's a very recognizable story just about anywhere, I would say, if you're looking at, you know, the struggles, at least gendered struggles that different nations have gone through historically. And I love the drama. I gotta say that. I do love the drama that it builds there, because we're trying to figure out if Emiku's going to be happy by the end of this. But then, of course, you have the looming threat of Godzilla or Gojira that kind of puts a question mark on, is there a happiness to have, basically? Like, how apocalyptic are we talking about with this situation? Which becomes clear by the end. And I don't mean because they eventually kill Gojira, but I just think that the moment that they do, they kind of make it clear that this thing was probably about to go back to sleep. That was my feeling here. It got pretty docile after freaking out for a little bit.
Yeah.
And just like tragedy on top of tragedy on top of tragedy on top of tragedy, this movie.
Yeah. And it even kind of goes back to like what the elder said, that like they, would see Gojira every couple years or so, and Gojira would, disappear or go away, So like I thought like it would have, been amazing to have, that different perspective, where all of the kind of, people in the big cities are trying to come up with something to do. But like, this is, where Dr. Tanake, right? Takane? Dr. Takane?
Professor Tanabe.
Tanabe, sorry. Apologies. Was getting there that like Gojira should be left alone, that we should maybe just study that this is a very ancient creature that's trying to exist in our completely like modern, human world and everything else, and was completely against trying to harm or destroy or murder Gojira and everything. And then to have the elder being like, well, Gojira will come and Gojira will go, you know what I mean? Like if only like that perspective had been kind of there, like for some of the people from the island community to be like, no, it's okay, like you don't have to, I mean, be afraid, yes, but like Gojira will go back to sleep, it's fine.
There's also something to be said there that the islanders have this perspective of, we can live for as much as nature allows us to, and you need to stop trying to force that. Because, as you said, be afraid, and basically accept the fact that when this thing is around, we are no longer the top of the food chain. So act as such and just protect yourselves, and it'll go away, and you are allowed to live your lives again. You don't try. We're not going out of our way to like throw bombs at tornadoes or anything, are we? And I liked that the film took this approach here, and it's not just a big animal. It is a force of nature. It is part of the earth, the ecosystem, and it seems to belong possibly even a little bit better than we do. When it gets to the mainland, you see that really clearly. The only thing it seems kind of pissed off about is like, what's all this crap doing all over here? I love that Gojira just like grabs a bridge and it's like, let's get this out of the way. You could just walk on the land, Right. And I'm sure that's just the part of a person being in the suit, but it does add this sort of thought process behind the actions of the character where, Gojira seems far more intent and has more intention behind its actions than just, say, if an alligator got trapped in your pool, Which, of course, adds to the tragedy of the whole thing, knowing that this creature seems to be more or less aware of the situation, just very confused, of course. But, I mean, it went home. It was like, okay, I've had enough of this. You're irritating me. I'm going to go back to sleep. We'll never know what was going to happen there, unfortunately. But again, where this movie gets me is that as much as I wanted them to explore that more, which they do in later films, I love that the film always comes back to, how is this affecting everybody? And what tiny little tragedies are happening in the wake of this? Which, of course, from a human perspective, are huge. They should be huge, at the very least. There's one scene in particular that gets me every single time. I can hear it in your voice. You probably know exactly the scene I'm about to talk about. It's the moment, and I know I've fast forwarded a little bit. I'm not big. Yeah, I don't do play-by-plays, unfortunately. Later in the film, during the big sequence, really long one, where we finally get Gojira just tearing up everything. I think that's when they introduced the atomic breath as well.
Oh.
You have a woman who's sitting on this balcony with her 3 kids, and Gojira's walking around, and she just holds her kids while they're crying. She's like, no, it's okay. It's okay. We're going to see daddy now. And just that kills me every single time. That scene, it just comes out of nowhere. And it's one of the only scenes where you get that kind of zoomed in perspective that isn't one of your protagonists. And I loved that they decided to do that, just to give you an idea of like all these little people you see running around.
Yeah.
This is what's going on in their heads.
Yeah. These are, like you mentioned, like these are people with families and children, and it was very quick in the beginning, you know, when we were still in the seaside fishing village, the family that was killed quickly from the house collapse, but for the movie to kind of slow down for a second and highlight this mother who's, you know, cradling her children, knowing that they won't survive, is just really powerful. And when you see some of, I think, the very first people who are trying to like run away from like the blast, like it calls back to some really poignant like history that, you know, when the atomic bomb like flashed, right, it was so quick, so sudden, and so powerful that it left behind the shapes of the people that were there, like whatever they were doing in their lives. It literally was like a snapshot like in time that was like etched into, whether it be like the flat pavement, whether it be stairs, whether it be like, you know, the side of a building, like whatever people were doing, like it was like, I guess you could maybe kind of compare it maybe to like Mount Vesuvius or like Pompeii or something like that, where people were literally like frozen in time in like this horrific moment.
I've seen the images. It's haunting stuff. And what cracks the mind for me a little bit is some of those positions are in motion. And you would, you know, we're so used to something like a photograph being so quick, but if you're in motion, it kind of blurs. So you would imagine that if you're moving at that point, maybe you'd have like a blurry smear of ash or something, and they are just locked in position. You can just see people almost at the, like if they were running, playing, whatever. And yeah, that is very evocative at this point when you see the flames go down the city street with everybody running away. You also have the radio host on one of the towers trying to get a good vantage point to kind of tell you what's going on throughout the city, and then Gojira goes straight for them. The haunting idea of hearing a known like news figure, a national news figure, just very calmly. No, I mean, okay, not super calmly, but as calmly as, I mean, he was loud and kind of freaking, but, you know, it still was very calm compared to what was happening. Just saying, okay, everybody, it's happening. So I've had a pleasure hosting you all, and goodbye and good night.
Yeah.
And then that was it. Tower is gone. Incredible stuff in this film. And I know that people who might be listening to this, who've seen a lot of films and disaster films, whatever, I know that these films do these things, but there's a way that it's done here. And it comes into, in my opinion, the aesthetics of the film. It comes into the visuals, the fact that it is in black and white. I know that wasn't necessarily a choice, you know, but I feel that the choice then was, if we have to do this in black and white, you up the contrast. You make sure that the blacks really create darkness when it's nighttime, and a lot of it takes place at night. And that use of music, the fact that there's barely any, and we just hear this, it really does feel like a strangely edited documentary, basically, in a lot of instances. And it just has this, I don't know, melancholy to it. I think that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
But this film, you know, doesn't have too many like moments of like levity or joy, quote unquote, because this is also a film where the director, you know, was working through a lot of grief and trauma and trying to be very respectful with the material. I mean, being a survivor himself, right, of the bombings, like that this was not that far removed in memory. Maybe for the youth, obviously, right? But for the adults, the elders that survived it, like, no, this was very fresh, like, in their memory. So, like, there's so much reverence for the survivors, for the victims, and even trying to be this phenomenal, like, anti-war, like, eco-horror piece. I think that's another thing as well, that this is a great eco-horror film.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, like, totally, like, my jam. Like, that that some of the very first horror stories I got into, right, were environmental horror stories. Like, not to be, you know, lighthearted or chuckly about it, but, like, I was obsessed with, like, all of the quote-unquote nuclear horror stories, because we were born, like, in the 90s or the 80s, right? So we were still kind of locked into fear of nuclear threat, or, like, nuclear scary, you know, abounding type thing. So, like, wasn't uncommon for me to have, like, a history book or be watching a documentary, like, with, like, rapt attention about, like, Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and, you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki Remembrance Day sort of things. Like, just fascinated with, like, mankind's capacity for destruction and, like, how horrific that goes.
Yeah, I also love how so in eco-horror films, and especially one that's framed and crafted the way this one was, they explore both the devastating power that nature wields, while also exploring what you were just talking about, that destructive nature of humanity. So very often what you get is that nature kind of snaps back, basically, at, so you want to see destruction, you don't know destruction. And at the same time, nature seems to kind of respect itself more, because the destruction that we have is not just human on human destruction. It's this disregard for the world that we live in and for the planet that we live on. The fact that you can drop a bomb that not only kills hundreds of thousands of people, it also devastates the landscape and actually leaves irreparable damage to a percentage of the planet. That's the fact that we could just do that in the blink of an eye because we had an argument about something. It's what it kind of boils down to. You know, ideological arguments can really get into that. So I can see why that's such a interesting topic, especially for someone our age. Yeah, I don't know if you had it when you were growing up, but in our schools, we still had, like, pamphlets and stuff on what to do if a bomb dropped. It was weird because they were leftovers. You know, we never lived in the same mindset that people in the early 80s did and before then. It felt like a relic.
Yeah.
And you see it all the time in films. And I was more interested or kind of morbidly curious about it because of my mom's stories about how they, like, genuinely did drills and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Or just, I don't know if you felt the same way, but for me, I always thought it was weird watching 80s movies with all these Russian villains.
Oh,
wow, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's interesting how, you know, Hollywood moves. You know, you and I know this, how it's like villain of the week kind of thing. It's like, okay, who's our antagonist this year? That's all. That's all the films for this. And honestly, you're right. Like, for a decade or more, it's just like, okay, this is our villain. These are all the villains for the movies. This is our antagonist. These are the people who want to rue destruction on everyone. You know, these are the big bads of the world. Like,
it's kind of a weird acknowledgement of the fact that people have the capacity to do absolutely horrible things, but then the narcissism of saying, but not me. And that has never appealed to me nearly as much as these sorts of films, the eco-horror films that try to show you that but being human is the problem and is the thing that you have to kind of suppress if you want to do right by nature. Are you going to go by nature or are you going to go by nurture? And nurture is what led to the bomb. Nature is Gojira, walking around, just surveying the area, and we're just constantly shooting at it.
Yeah.
Our nurture, essentially, our societal development on kill it. I don't know what it is. I want to briefly touch upon the quote that I brought in, because I think this is a good moment, what we're talking about right now. So just to recap that, they're talking about how beauty is objective. I've mentioned this. Okay, for those who have not listened to season 1 on the Anatomy of a Scream's feed, beauty tends to be seen philosophically as an objective feeling and aesthetic category. There's a lot of contention on this, because the mere fact that I have this podcast is to explore different perspectives on beauty, which would kind of break down the objective claim about it. But I do understand where they're getting at when they talk about it being objective. I think it's more like you know it when you know it, when you feel it, when you experience it. I think we all know what we're talking about. But when it comes to our taste, what actually conjures it up is where it gets a little murkier. But in this case, I want to apply it specifically to Gojira as a film, but also as an entity. And how, so they say, beauty is an objective property of things. It's apprehended through the delight we take in simply knowing them as they are. That's why I chose this quote, because I feel that that is where just a very strong sense of beauty lies in this film for me.
Yeah.
Is that exploration of Gojira and what it is as it is, seeing those moments of it just walking around and doing its own thing. Also, I should say that quote comes from Ronald E. Roblin from his book On Beauty and Ugliness in Art. He was a philosopher who worked quite a bit about beauty and aesthetics. And so this is one of the books that he wrote about this in the 1970s. When you think about Gojira and beauty specifically, where does your brain kind of go? What was one of the first things that kind of comes to mind for you?
You weren't wrong. Like the visuals of this film have just like been seared into my mind for years and years and years. That just the iconic shape that Gojira makes, like cutting across the skyline, like that there's nothing in our modern world that is as big or as ancient. Like, sure, we still have tortoises running around. We still have like crocodiles and other kind of, reptiles, but there's nothing that is its size or from a completely different era before mankind. So
right.
It just is surreal, like something out of like Doctor Who or something. I guess for reference, just like it's surreal to see this ancient creature walking around, swimming around, right? Just in the bottom of the ocean, just like hanging out, like eating fish, going to sleep. Like that I have to, give, obviously like full props to the original suit, I'm not sure what I would say. Suit actor. There we go. Suit actor. Yeah. Complete props to them. Obviously, they couldn't see. They could hardly hear in the thing. Like it was swelteringly hot in that thing. Like complete like props to the actor. I don't know. Also, just the choice that, intentionally this was made in black and white. Like it could have been made in color, but the punch, like you said, was even better in black and white. And even I'm just gonna be honest, when I watched it again yesterday, the black and white also does kind of help hide some things.
Oh yeah.
So let's be honest. There were some moments in here I was like, oh, look at the little prop airplanes and the cute little the toy tanks and different things that now we'd have the technology to do, but back then, they were just like, let's get some miniature sets, let's get, some little fake airplanes, like, so it was honestly kind of cute. And I was like, oh, look at 1954. This is too cute. So especially on our big screens now that like they've remastered the film, quote unquote, and like redigitized it for our big screen, so now you can see all of those little those little 1954 things. So.
And it's like there are so many things that it actually improves that you can see details in. So you can actually see the expression on Gojira's face. You can see, the fish really well inside the fish tank. And these little details are great. But yeah, to your point, like there's a moment when they have the typhoon come in and they have a helicopter getting tipped over. Oh, you just had to slow it down, didn't you? I understand. It was very clearly just like a toy that was closer to the camera. I love it though. It's if you just keep your suspension of disbelief there and just sit and watch and stay in the world, you still feel the weight of it all. But there's a part of your modern sensibility, of course, that is like, I appreciate what you were doing here. And some of the effects are just still mind-boggling to me. There's plenty of them that I don't know how you did it. There are featurettes out there, and you can learn how to did it, but I kind of don't want to know the magic tricks. The effect that comes back in just all the Showa era movies that I love the most is when you get the pylons and they melt.
Yeah.
I just think it looks so cool.
Yeah.
And I think it's just like electricity.
Huh.
Because I've seen that before. You have like these wires that if you pump them with electricity, they'll stay rigid. The moment you turn it off, they'll start sagging and bending.
Huh.
I think that's what they did, but I don't know. They're also melting, like glowing. So
yeah, that is very curious. Like I'd be curious to know like what materials they used to like you said, get that melting effect and warping and all of that kind of thing. It was just really just kind of surreal watching this film that the creators were firing on these kind of eldritch horror, imaginings even back then. Like,
yeah,
that something can be so far out of our comprehension to, have this, prehistoric creature that has obviously undergone some kind of metamorphosis due to, the exposure to radiation and everything else, that it can blast this destructive, breath beam and some of these things just sound like, how on earth did you kind of come up with these incredible ideas that obviously these were people that were thinking so far into the future that didn't feel maybe stifled by maybe kind of commonplace horrors that were thinking of I know obviously there's Afrofuturism, but I'd be curious about what the title or what that may be in Japanese society for the same exact kind of cultural thing where people are thinking in Japanese futuristic, setting and society and horror kind of space. Thinking about the fact that this was made in 1954, my dad was 2 years old when this movie came out. So yeah, it's wild that this is my parents' lifetime movie.
It also generated a lot of films that tried to mimic it, especially in the West. That's when we got the big radioactive kick, things like Them. You got to see Tarantula, all these different bugs and stuff that they try to make really big and scary, which obviously just comes down to the special effects of okay, what can we make and how, now that we know the camera technique and people are into it, how can we milk this a bit? But this particular one is way ahead of its time. The mere thought of, I'm going to have this giant lizard walk around and blow things up with its breath, as you said, not even thinking about the technology of that and saying, no, we're going to do it, is just, it's 1954. How are you going to get this thing to shoot fire out of its mouth in a convincing way without it being just a flamethrower, basically? So I love the use of the special effects as well, and just the imagination on display to tell a story that has such weight and historical significance to it too. It is kind of like the film is both looking forward and backward at the same time, depending on what aspect of it you are focused on.
Right.
And it also, you were talking before about tradition, how this is explored through the different characters. And that, I think, plays into it as well. That, if we go back to Emiko real quick, she is a character, so an archetype that is exploring this, what will the future hold, but also she is a product of the past and dealing with the ramifications of the past.
Right.
What I love that they explore with her, and I mentioned this to my partner when I was watching it today, you have the fact that she holds on to the secret that Serizawa has made the oxygen destroyer. This devastating, just H-bomb on steroids, basically. It is worse than anything that's ever been created because it can liquefy matter. And you have, in Japan, of course, honor is a very important thing. Being respectful and true to your word is very important culturally. So you have the dilemma with her. Not only does she not want to be in the arranged marriage, I love you brought that up. So that's probably already got people like clutching their pearls, like, oh, just do what you're told.
Right.
Just stop questioning it. Stop being so just talkative about the whole thing. You have that, this movie really focusing on it. And then you have the fact that she has the weight of, if I tell everybody, we're safe. We have a future. If I don't tell everybody, I'm true to my word. I uphold tradition. And therefore, I'm being a good Japanese woman. For the time, at least. I loved the dilemma throughout this film. And I love that she made the choice to think beyond herself by the end of the film. I would love to know the audience response to the moment she gives away the fact that Serizawa has the bomb.
Yeah.
Because in a Western film, I don't think it has that much weight. So it made sense to me that this had an American version of it, because you can easily do that and Americans would be like, oh, good, you saved the world. America, yeah, saving people. But for the touchiness of all of this, the fact that you have all of the trauma from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fact that you have tradition that just kind of stifles saving anybody in the situation, therefore you cannot actually get out of your traumatic experiences, you have to change, right? That's kind of what the necessity arises. We have to change. Nobody likes to change. And this happens so often in life that we go through these mass changes. And I think Emiko is such a powerful figure and character of, at the time, the changes of modern Japan.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why I brought up very early on, like, that this film has so many different story beats and threads going on. Like I mentioned, with the, kind of pushing against capitalism, returning to a more environmental, way of being or coexisting with nature that was being moved further and further away from. I think it's very important and even telling that the film started, with the smaller fishing communities, the villages, the spiritual practitioners, and then moved completely into the cities and didn't go back. Like, I think that was very intentional. It's interesting, like when you brought up how technology has been pushing Japan further and further onward. So, like when, let's say, Emiko was a little girl, when she experienced what she did at Hiroshima or Nagasaki, that the community would have still been kind of in this in-between place of like rural and a populous city, that even then the nation was going through this kind of transformation, but like most of Japan was still quite, agrarian, quite rural, and there was a respect for the people. And I don't know if there was classism in the way that we would understand it, but there was like a communal like respect for everyone, from those who worked in, the agrarian society, to those who worked in the cities, to those who worked in, the textiles and the factories and so on and so forth. And that Emiko is a byproduct of that she's, her father's a scientist, like everyone kind of around her are in these like moving and kind of shaking fields that are pushing Japan into this new era, and she's going to be a direct like byproduct of that. Like she's a scientist as well, like like it was like really cool to see her like going on the different kind of what would I say, like Gojira location scavenger hunts, if you will. Like,
that was cool.
She was like right there along beside her father, like, you know, writing down Geiger counter reading recordings and like taking snapshots and like being like a full like fledged scientist and like not being shamed for it, like being respected for like her opinion. Like it was just like, wow. And the fact that it's still quote unquote radical to see women scientists like now just being people and like kind of living their lives and having their own choice, and like that this film was doing it like back then, and it was not even like a blink. I can't remember. I don't think there were any scenes where anyone told like Emiko stay in your place or be quiet or, you know, locking her up in a room really. Or like no scenes of like violence against her, like in any way, like, you know, shaming her for being a woman or anything like that.
If anything, there's actually just one moment where she kind of just decides to help ease the kind of masculine woes of her suitor, of Ogata, because, you know, they have the more or less arranged relationship between the two. But then, you know, with Serizawa, they have that past. And she's like, look, Serizawa's always kind of been an older brother to me, and I still see him as such. But he even says to her, like, thank you, Emiko, because he knows exactly what she's saying, that he's having troubles, like, well, you know, you're around this guy, you got a past, and I'm getting really insecure over here. And she's like, oh, he doesn't mean anything, even though she's making it very deliberate, like, I'm saying this so you will feel okay.
Yeah.
And because by the end of it, the fact that the way she breaks down, you would do with family, but it was the line that they have that after Serizawa sacrifices himself to make sure nobody could use the oxygen destroyer again, Ogata turns to her and says, he wishes us a good life. And she just dramatically turns around and starts breaking down. Also, you see the moment when Serizawa shows her how the destroyer works as well. She goes into his arms in a very intimate kind of way as well. So I just love that, you know, she also has the upper hand in that relationship too, where she's like, okay, I'll make you feel better. And then in the end, never is she told to step aside, girl.
Yeah.
None of that.
I love that it didn't fall into that trope where like two men are like fighting over her, trying to posture and everything. Like it was very refreshing. So obviously that's kind of my inundated with American media, you know, framework coming into play. But like, you know, we've seen it in other nations' films as well. So, but it's powerful that it's not here. And something else that, speaking of Serizawa, like, I'm sure we're going to get there, but I think it's important how that the events of the war, like, left no one unscathed, right? Because it's so close in recent memory that, you know, she even mentioned that, like, Serizawa, lost his eyesight, like, in the war, and, like, he's still, like, a visual reminder with his eye patch. And, I'm sure, like, maybe, like, if this was a little more recent, maybe they would have scarred his face a little or something like that, or shown kind of more graphically. But the fact that it was there, it was a statement that was made, is, like, very powerful and quite poignant. So, like, both of them are actually, like, two traumatized children, right, from this era, who are both kind of trying to navigate this world in this new way. Like, Serizawa with science, and, like, really falling kind of headlong into grief and trauma, like, in a different way, like shutting himself off from, like, connection with others, and just fully kind of wrapping himself up in his work. And, Yeah, there's something in there that's very sad about how like young people are trying to navigate this grief of this, these traumatic incidents that happened.
Yes, and in the case of Serizawa too, we see this reconciliation to an extent. Him processing all of this trauma in a very interesting and intellectual way. He decides to, basically, by being driven by the fear and the trauma of the experience of that bomb, he creates something far worse because he plays with the same sciences. Basically, he needs to understand it because it's not understandable, basically. As you were talking about, that eldritch horror, the fear of the unknown. It plays a lot in this film. When we think of eldritch horror, obviously, pop culture-wise, we're expecting tentacles and portals to other dimensions, but the heart of all of that has always been the fact that there are things in this universe that you'll never know, and you don't get to know. It freaks people out, right? When you'll never get to know that. Yeah. You'll die before and there are things that no one will ever know. That's where it gets really scary. And I love that they explored his trauma there without him flat out saying it. There's no big scene of him panicking or I have to do this because of whatever. It's just there. They just show slice of life, and it's there for us to find ourselves and pick apart. Because honestly, until you were really talking about it in that way, I didn't quite pick up what I'm saying right now. This is inspired heavily on your description of his actions and the fact that we're talking about this generational trauma. Because of course, he would have been a child at the time. I don't know why my brain never made the connection, but it did for the woman in the the train car. For some reason, when they said in the war, my brain immediately went, man, war, eye patch, soldier. But he would have been way, way older because it's about 15, 20 years apart from each other. And then you see it with Emiko. She just happened to have a very good and structured environment from her father, who's just a very benevolent man. You see him processing his trauma as well. He's much older. He was old enough to understand that war.
Yeah.
And that's why he's sitting here going like, I don't know why they won't study it. Why you got to kill everything? It just weighs on him.
Yeah, that like bombs got us in this predicament in the first place.
Yeah. And you all know it. You're all talking about it. All the adults are talking about that because they're all traumatized. And he's like, so why don't you just stop doing it? It's a fascinating thing. We're doing this now. Yeah. Our generation are doing this with 9/11. We see, because the trauma of that wasn't just planes hitting buildings. It was a cultural divide was no longer divided in the most violent way imaginable. And therefore, we witnessed xenophobia just slap us in the face in America. And then we just met it with more xenophobia. So then we created more trauma for other cultures within the same culture, and just it started to splinter and shatter everything. And it's amazing how we're not doing anything to fix that. We just feed more and more xenophobia on top of it and think that one day it's going to fix it, right? And again, this is all just coming about in my brain because of this movie. I want to make that clear to everybody listening as well. Like, I'm not walking around thinking these things all the time, sometimes, but this movie is bringing this to mind because it's showing, I can only give context for what I have experienced, but it is showing people who are processing very similar emotions, just with different details, basically.
Yeah. I love that you brought up earlier this kind of through line about the ramifications of humans creating, mass destructive things, right? What's really ironic, right, is that humans are incredibly susceptible to like radiation, sickness, illness, whatever.
Yeah.
But like nature rebounds, and like not only rebounds but like thrives. That like humans are
right
the weaker ones in the scenario. So like, for example, like we brought up Chernobyl, right? Like around Pripyat and everything else and the surrounding location, like it's a paradise there. Like it's gorgeous. Like the other like animals that haven't like been seen in the area before, like humans started to settle it, like came back and like are thriving. And it's just really interesting, like humans, meddling, like caused all of this chaos. Like, if you think about it, all Gojira was just doing was just like eating the fish and like going away. Yeah. Like, but the oxygen destroyer killed all of the fish in the surrounding area.
Exactly. They talk about the ramifications, like this will destroy a mass ecosystem. Our trade's going to fall apart. We won't have a food source for our own people. We have to evacuate 1,675 feet of the coastal line. So that far away from the coast, you'd have to evacuate just because any water that's up there would get affected by this bomb. And you're just going to do that for one animal that's kind of leaving you alone right now.
Totally. Like,
wild.
It is. It's just it's so befuddling. Like, the equation is so simple. Like, yeah, so easy. Like,
and to their credit, though, I mean, at the same time, I do understand on an emotional level, especially on a species level, if we were to look at something like Gojira, we'd also be like, so how do we survive this?
Yeah.
And if the only thing that you have is like, well, we can kill it, I think we would accept it even if it made us sad. Totally.
And, just that shot. Oh, another scene that actually makes me emotional, like besides the, because there's obviously death all around in this film, right? Yeah. Between, the mother dying and then like the oxygen destroyer going off and like seeing like Gojira's like last gasps and trying to like survive this oxygen destroyer thing, like seeing its body like wither away, like, and the fact that they show it, like they like linger on it. It's like, some movies we know might cut away, be like, oh no, our favorite, monster or creature or whatever is dead, and like would cut away and show people crying or whatever, but like lingering on the death of this, really beautiful and sad, mysterious creature.
And they do it earlier too, when you think that they're going to do that very Hollywood thing when they show the first moment with Serizawa showing Emiko the destroyer, because she just is like, and she turns. They do exactly what you were saying. They show the face of somebody who is disturbed by it, and then they cut to them walking away, going like they're not looking each other in the eye, stuff like that. And I love that they then later go, when she explains it to Ogata. You get the flashback, and they show in gruesome detail these fish turning into skeletons in the water and disintegrating, and just how long it took, and just how they just had to stand there and just watch them die. And yep, I guess the movie was kind of priming you for like, oh yeah, you're going to see this. We're going to make you feel real bad when this happens.
Yeah, it's like there's these moments in the film that are just like dread, like doom inducing. So like doom inducing because like Gojira's gonna come on land and like kill a whole bunch of people. Doom and dread because the oxygen destroyer is eventually going to be used, and like it's like kind of up in the air, like who's it gonna kill or who's gonna go down there with it. Are the people in the surrounding area going to die too from it? Like, I mean, there's like all of these kind of, it's very like a very kind of anxiety inducing film because like, that like death is like abundant, like rampant throughout this film. And like, it's so bleak, like in the way that this movie, older movies, okay, this is for the children, older movies used to have all of the credits before the film started. So when the movie said the end, that literally meant the end. Nothing else.
I miss it. I totally miss it. Look at the extremity our films have to go to these days, just so you sit through the credits and go, Jesus Christ, at the end of the movie. It just gotta, okay, I'm gonna breathe for a moment and just, oh, man, that's who the gaffer was. Okay. Like a little, I'm happy this was a movie. Okay, good, credits. Yeah, it's fake. Okay. But there's something about this. And also, another thing, so gather around, children. Not only did we have the credits at the beginning, there was a very specific way you would end these movies. Often you would have like this really whimsical dun 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 kind of music to let you know it was all a movie. That was their attempt to give you the end. Like even Psycho has it. That you're like, oh, that's a tonal shift. This movie did not do this.
No.
This movie just shows the sea devoid of life with the sun coming up. Because of course it is. Another day has started with everything is dead. And then you just see the kanji symbol. And of course, if you're watching it with subtitles, the subtitle will pop up, but it just zooms in slowly. End. And the music that's playing is the sound of the women singing the ancient prayers that they were singing during the destruction through the film. So they're actually praying for Gojira, basically, at the end of the film. And you just... do you have the Criterion Blu-ray of this? Have you seen that?
Okay, so I watched it on, I have HBO Max, so obviously that has like the tie-in with Turner Classic, and they have the Criterion version of the film, so.
Okay, so the reason I ask is because since I have the disc, I actually have the menu for it too, and now granted, this is not the singular one, they have just Gojira as a set, but this is the Showa era set, and the book that it comes with is really pop arty, and I promise everybody this has a point. And it's very colorful, this book. A lot of good artwork. It's really big, bright. The book is yellow with pink letters that say Godzilla, all kinds of stuff. And that's the menu for this movie, is like this pink and green Godzilla drawing on this bright yellow background. So this black and white, bleak-ass movie that ends with this, like, you killed it. Are you happy now? You killed it kind of ending.
Yeah.
Pop goes back to yellow and pink. And like, thank you for watching this Godzilla movie from this God. We were just sitting in awe at the tonal shift between the menu and the film. And it doesn't help. I can say that much. I'm just sitting looking at all these bright colors. It's very sad at the end of this movie. And I almost feel like it's calculated. I think somebody in Criterion was like, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, it was a choice. Quite the mood whiplash there. Like,
yeah, another power for aesthetics there too. If you change your color palette quite suddenly, you get a bit of a visceral response to your eyes. But if the tone of the colors are usually used for, to convey a particular emotion that completely is antithesis to the emotion that you were experiencing, it's quite an experience to go through. I think they're doing it because they know it's such a bleak movie, but it was quite interesting for me to see them do that. Still, back to the film though, I loved that by virtue of it being an older film, it had the credits at the beginning, and they really made use of that whole structure.
Yeah, totally.
And you saw it a lot though. I mean, the 1930s Universal monster movies as well would often have that big tragic moment at the end too. So you just go, oh man, life is sad.
And I love that you brought up like what American monster giant creature feature movies were doing. They were doing the complete opposite of what Gojira was doing, right? Like those movies have like none of like the gravitas or seriousness or even reckoning or grappling with the history of like imperialism, warmongering, anti like nuclear, slant that Gojira was going for. Like these other movies are just kind of popcorn flicks. Yeah. Like they're not really super deep or super, reflective or remorseful or anything. They're just kind of, like, well, we brought this thing here, we're just gonna blow it up, the end. Like no kind of emotional, like, response, like visceral response. Like rewatching, Universal or RKO pictures or, the different horror films of the era that were doing these big monster movie type things. It's jarring to watch very robotic kind of movies, like very, they're paced the same way, they're written pretty much the same way, the monsters or creatures are introduced pretty much the same way, with like no kind of, you know, like no emotional, no tears, like no reflection, nothing. It's just kind of,
yeah. Which happens to the Godzilla franchise after a while. You know, they do start to emulate what America has been doing with it, because as you're talking about what they have with Shin Gojira is, hey, we can make some plushies and stuff on this. Capitalism really starts to sink its claws into the whole thing, which is so ironic considering the whole heart of what was in this movie. And it is inevitable, isn't it?
yeah.
But it's interesting, though, how even in the earlier color films that do capitalize on that and try to give a more popcorn kind of film, they still focus on the radioactive aspects of it and a little bit of the origins of Godzilla and what it meant. Or maybe they include a new thing, that like a new fear. For instance, the mere fact that they went for a more capitalistic approach, they kind of started to parody the fact that capitalism was coming from a foreign land. So you were literally being invaded through your economy. And so then you get entities like King Ghidorah, which is a literal alien that's just wreaking havoc and destroying shit. So I liked how it started out, but of course about halfway through, then we do get to a point where we're just like, well, I don't know, he's got a kid now. And they have a lot of monsters.
Yeah, like literally on MeTV, the Svengoolie movie was King Kong versus Godzilla. And my dad was like, what is this $1.25 movie? Like, what is this? I was like, Daddy, it's King Kong versus Godzilla.
Yeah. Just Japan doing it right, basically. Having some fun with their toys, basically. And this broaches a topic that I also wanted to get in on when I was watching the film. It's strange thing that happens with predominantly Western viewers. And I'm going to say English natives. So England, Canada, and US. So like North America and I'd say England. Or let's say even just the UK in general. That people don't like to watch movies with subtitles, right? You get that part of it, but then you also get the part of a lot of stereotypes come from these movies, which unfortunately shape the way people view other cultures. You know, we live through media quite strongly. And again, I know some people who listen to the things that I say on this podcast are like, when are you going to talk about aesthetics? And I want to let you all know, I have been talking about aesthetics this entire time. Deeper emotions are linked to our aesthetic responses and things that we're experiencing. And media holds this, especially visual media like this. The classic image you get. And I remember one of the first things I ever saw about Godzilla parodies and stuff. I want to say it was in Austin Powers that they do this gag, but they actually have like, I don't remember the movie anymore, but they had like an actual giant dinosaur kind of like robot running rampant in a street, and everybody's running away to parody the way people run away from Godzilla. And they're like, Gojira. And of course, a Japanese person has to walk up and go, Gojira, and run by. And we're like, the 90s have aged wonderfully. Not a fine wine, just an old wine. Let's put it that way. And it always got me thinking when I look back on this, like, how could people get that attitude? You get the attitude of like, oh, they all look alike. I hear a lot of people say nasty things like this. And I'm thinking, the only thing that has ever really gotten to me was the fact that I don't understand the language. And because I don't understand it, I don't hear words all the time. You know, the more you understand the language, the more clearly you hear isolated words and sounds. But it is a bunch of gobbledygook if you hear a language for the first time that has no sounds that resemble the sounds of your language. And I think that's where people are kind of responding the most, instead of really looking at like facial expressions or learning cultural differences. Because if you know even a little bit about Japan, if I think about the first time I saw Gojira, it was, hey, this is that disaster movie with a dinosaur. And it's awesome. When I'm an adult now and I have a vested interest in Japan and I've learned a few words and I learned a bit about the culture, not nearly as much as you have, I'm very impressed. But, you know, just enough that I can see, oh, shit, this means something. Oh, that's heavy. You know, how we can talk about the taboos of just Emiko's what we would consider very normal behavior. But if you know a little bit about history, you know a little bit about other cultures, it enriches your experience of it. And then you see aesthetics that change in your experience of them because they're no longer just a foreign aesthetic. They're foreign in that they have a different weight and context, but it doesn't mean that they don't come from the same place that aesthetics that you were used to might have as theirs. You know, they have a different source. But human emotion is transcendent. I think that's so important for people to understand.
Yeah.
Empathy is transcendent. And it's not hard to empathize with other people from other walks of life and from other cultures if you take that breather and just have a moment, evaluate where your I guess blind spots are, and try to learn. It's so enriching, and I love watching foreign films because of this. And also, we use the term foreign films only because we're coming from our perspective from being Americans, right?
Right.
Living in the Netherlands, the amount of times I see American films in the foreign film section, it's interesting to me. So even that term has a very relative kind of connotation to it. So note, American listeners, you are foreign to a lot of people.
Right. A lot of our just ways of being, like, I think I love how you brought up how obviously in our movies, you know, this still even kind of slips in sometimes, like subtle racism and xenophobia and everything else. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's blatant. It kind of depends on the medium. But like other countries have the same thing. Like looking at like American-ness, American culture, trying to dissect, because America has so many different ethnic groups, racial groups living in it. You know,
right?
Them trying to understand how this whole continent like works, you know, is like really interesting. And I'm sure if some people saw some of these other films and TV shows like picking at us, oh goodness, like, ooh, I'm sure. Like,
and honestly, if you learn more about those cultures beyond the major films or media, and then look back at those major films and media that you know so much. Let's say, take like anime in Japan. You know, it's one thing to know Pokemon, Digimon, Dragon Ball Z, the things that were westernized and got their dubbing and then thrown in Naruto, those things. It's another thing to really dig in and learn more about it, that, you know, the ones that don't really make it to the United States are the ones that are so steeped in Japanese folklore and ideology that it's hard to translate it. So if you were to learn more about those things, you would be surprised if you look back at Dragon Ball Z and stuff and see how much it is really making fun of American cartoons. And same thing with these Godzilla films, the later ones. I urge everybody to go watch, I think it was Astro Monster was the name of it.
Yeah.
That one, it has so much in there that is a self-parody, because they're really acknowledging what kind of franchise this thing turned into. But all of the archetypes are from the West. They are just clowns in capitalist suits, basically, doing their thing. And I love it. You got to be self-aware. You got to laugh at things like that, especially if you come from that position of power. As an American, you do culturally have that. And then, of course, me being a white guy, like, even more so, like, you got to laugh at those things. You really don't have thin skin about that sort of stuff, but don't get it out of your system to constantly look for a way to punch down as well. Try to learn more about others. Build your empathy, and you will understand yourself, but also humanity a lot more. The things that confuse you in life become a lot more clear because you can put yourself into other people's shoes. And this is a great starting point. Gojira is one of those movies that I think that the more you watch it, the less you get stuck in the sensationalism, and the more you can focus on the human part of the story. Totally.
I think maybe I feel like we're coming gradually to a close, but
feels like it.
One of those cultural things, like you mentioned, which is quite relevant today, is that there are so many different, even I would say even time period clashes kind of going on, and it's just like just a part of the culture, just the way things are. So like, for example, like when the family is at home, especially the father, for example, you'll notice he dresses like he takes off the suit and tie and, you know, and puts on very traditional like robes and clothing. Like it's very interesting that he does that. And even some of the ways that they operate at home are still very traditional and domestic. That the home even has this blending of traditional styling, but also very like kind of modern technology. Like some homes try to do this now, but try to bring the outside inside as far as like the way the space is built. And it's very interesting that even like in Japanese society today, like Japanese, Korea, other places, that like the young people are like pushing to like, you know, we want to wear, you know, the traditional clothing. We want to wear grandma and grandpa's, you know, hanbok and like, you know, robes and silks and finery just as like everyday clothing. It's just so surreal and beautiful, like surreal and beautiful because it's to our eye and to our brain, you know, it works, and it's beautiful to see young people like us and people around the world that are still appreciating this film and its overall cultural legacy, and that so many people all over the world have been brought together because of this iconic piece of media is just really something that other films of its same exact era have like fallen into obscurity. But like Gojira is bigger, more powerful, literally and metaphorically, than like all of its contemporaries, like by a landslide.
Like for every one of them that is known in certain pockets, or like maybe somebody in their family, that their particular family might generation by generation still love particular books or films or whatever. Or let's say films from that era. Indeed, I'd say Gojira is just such a mass entity. Yeah, it's funny how we have to talk about it in large scale when we're talking about such a large animal. But the concept and the sheer impact, the cultural impact of this film has transcended culture. It's transcended time. And it really, I honestly feel like it really wasn't until the 90s that happened again with all of the anime that poured into the United States.
Yeah.
And to this day, you know, like look at Pokemon. It is not slowed down at all. It felt like it was going to for a moment. Like, okay, it's finally ending. Okay, well, this has lived itself out, and then or not. You're just as cool and common as you've ever been. And I'd say the same for Gojira. The more they make movies, the longer it's gonna survive, and hopefully, if the spirit of this original film continues to return from time to time, because I'm not saying that there's anything wrong that the franchise took a more popcorn fun approach. I mean, if you have a property like this, have fun with it, I say, as long as you don't take away from what you were initially intending in the process. If we had gotten to a point where nobody had heard of the original, but we only knew about Mechagodzilla and King Ghidorah and all that, then it would have been a different story. But there's a reason that this movie has its own release from Criterion, as well as is part of the box set. And it shows up in so many bargain bin DVDs everywhere. It just keeps getting resold to you because it's important and because it, frankly, is just that good. It's that good of a movie.
Yeah. Minimal budget aside, like as much as obviously as they could do with, you know, the shoestring that they were working with, like they put like their heart and soul and everything into this movie, and it just shows. And it, like he said, it's a timeless film. Like when we're elderly and old and like we're still going to be like, I remember when I first saw that movie. You know, like we're going to be those old hopefully not curmudgeons, but who knows, that are
I'm already a curmudgeon.
yeah, that will still be like that, you know, the young people around us will be like, well, when did you first see it? Or like, have you heard of this movie called Gojira?
Yeah.
Like, they're going to be looking at us like...
It's going to blow my mind the first time I talk to somebody. Like, let's say when I'm in my 40s, first time I speak to someone who's like 12. And they have like a Godzilla toy.
Yes.
I'd be like, hey kid, come over here. Let's
talk.
really educate you on this.
Yeah.
About to blow your little mind.
Yeah, like it's totally nothing for like kids to be like, woo, new Godzilla movie, woo, you know, like King Kong has been like fading, in my opinion, like more and more into kind of the annals and the recesses, even though there's been this new King Kong versus Godzilla. Like King Kong didn't have the same impact because, let's be real, and we're gonna have to, I think, talk about it, because it's a film that's it's contemporary, like as far as big wide scale epic monster creature feature extravaganza, right?
Yeah.
That King Kong was operating on a completely different like level, that it didn't grapple with the same topical and timeless themes, that it didn't really get into, let's say, like race or like the imagery of its anti-indigenous, you know, themes. Like, you know, it didn't get into heavy territory the way Gojira did. And like, and obviously, and I'm just be honest, like Gojira just looks cooler visually, like so like, I mean,
especially old ones. If you compare those two, it's like, I mean, Gojira is miles. I mean, granted, it is 20 years later, but still, just like, no, there's no contest.
Yeah, and that's like, I you know, speaking of the beauty of horror, right? Like the beauty of Gojira's like whole entire just shape, size, stature,
sound,
appearance, powers, like every time like Gojira comes up in like a head-to-head, like who's gonna win versus battle, like Gojira wins like every time, like clears everyone off the board. Because Gojira is a land and a seafaring creature, and I think it's amazing again that like the director and the writers like thought about this prehistoric creature is, you know, semi-aquatic, is a upright, you know, walking, you know, mammal. Well, I don't know if mammal, but like semi-aquatic thing.
Reptile.
Reptile. Thank you. Yeah, like every time, like hands down, no holds barred. Like I knew how the new King Kong versus Godzilla movie was gonna go. Like I knew immediately. I was like, yeah, Godzilla.
If they knew their stuff, you know, if they really knew what they were talking about. Like there's always the risk with later filmmakers picking up these properties. And it's the thing that's happened with other franchises as well. You always hear like, okay, well, we're real fans. We're going to get to the heart and core of this. And as I kind of said at the beginning of this, you do have different perspectives about the same thing. And I've seen it time and time again with like Halloween, Godzilla, King Kong, name any slasher that's had reboots. And if you read all of those accounts, and you can easily just have your feelings hurt because you're like, what movie did you watch that you made this movie out of it? And some people, I think, were really afraid of that with Godzilla versus Kong, or Kong versus Godzilla. To not go too deeply into it, I do agree with you that it's an interesting thing to discuss real quick, is just how, like, if you look at King Kong as the contemporary of it, one of the main reasons it seems to have not kicked off as well, and honestly, so few films have been made, is because the Kong we have now in our Kong versus Godzilla and in Kong Skull Island and stuff is kind of a recontextualization and a completely new reboot where they're trying to apply the Godzilla formula to the Kong character. But that is not really what happened in the original films. As you said, that it was more anti-indigenous. It was more about it was almost like perpetuating cultural appropriation, but showing just enough about the dangers of messing with things you don't really understand. But when it comes to like the racial readings of Kong, that comes far more from coding than it comes from any intent of the film. Whereas Gojira's themes are embedded into the story. They're there on display. It's in the dialogue. They make a clear connection between the bombings and this force. They reference real-life occurrences visually and audibly so that you understand this is what we're getting at. And that, for me, is where the longevity of this particular entity and character comes from, is the point to it. I'm a huge fan of a film with a point to it. They don't all need to have a point to them, but I will say Kong was a sensationalist film that was pretty much made to go, hey, look at the giant gorilla, do some cool stuff. Very Harryhausen idea behind it. Look at my special effects. Whereas Gojira felt to me like Honda's very smart instincts as a filmmaker to say, I'm going to market a movie that tells you it's sensational and is sensational. And I'm going to put a very important story in there and tell you, or basically process my emotions through it and help other people do the same thing, while also educating people who may have forgotten about this horrible event. More of that in my life would be wonderful. I like that. So, and for me, I love when horror films decide to do that. And, you know, it's funny how we have this whole elevated term that comes around. I think Gojira is a wonderful example to say, like, this is nothing new. Exploring deeper things and themes in a film that is essentially about something else on the surface is nothing new. And it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy the surface. There are times I watch Gojira just to go, yeah, stomp it, kill it, do it. And then there are times that I'm watching it to really feel the weight of what it's trying to say. You know, that's your choice as a viewer.
Yeah, like I'm so protective of what the original intent of Gojira was that I'm very protective. And when I saw like the Americanness start to trickle in,
right,
to trying to capitalize on Gojira, it put a really sour taste in my mouth. Like, I remember being just like almost like offended at the, let's say, the 1999. Was it 99? Yeah. I think
98.
98.
Whoa.
That was. Yeah, that was like, I was like, okay, now this is disrespectful. Because I mean, I see what they wanted to make some big movie with a big creature in it, but it could have not been called Godzilla. Like, come on, like, like it just seemed like very kind of flippant. They were just like, oh, just pick. Well, we're going to make a Godzilla movie, and this is how we want to make it. But like, just completely throwing in the bin like everything that like Godzilla even means as.
Yeah.
And even the new films, the American ones that are kind of more invested in the spectacle. Like, they're very pretty, like, you know, they're very gorgeous. They're really nice to look at. But in the back of my mind, I keep, like, Shin Gojira, once we get there, we're going to get there.
Oh, yeah. Can't wait.
Like,
I have not seen it fully, and I'm going to wait until time.
Yeah. When you have that juxtaposed to what the American movies are doing, it's just like, wow, like, a lot of American audiences, because they haven't seen it or have no frame of reference for it, like, really don't know what they're missing. As far as like, you know, how important and like how reverential I think we should be with the Gojira story. And like, if you're gonna have quote unquote fun with it, I think be careful. Like,
yeah,
tread lightly, I guess.
And at the very least, come back to it. That's what I think they did really well in the Showa era, was they got a little into parody territory and had a little too much fun. You know, some champagne was drank at some of these premieres. And then every time Honda picked up one of those scripts, he was like, yeah, but we're doing it this way. Because now I'm going to talk about xenophobia. Now I'm going to talk about this disaster that people haven't heard about. Or, you know, then they put it in the hands of a newcomer and they're like, pollution. We have a pollution problem, y'all. Mm-hmm. So they always manage to give you this enemy of the film kind of formula while still managing to put some semblance of topical eco horror in there. And although none of them really tread on territory the way this one did, apart from maybe the terror of Mechagodzilla, I think is when they kind of sparked, like, we really need to start getting focused again. I think they, of course, leave it to the progenitors, to Japan, to kind of know how to have fun with it more than just pure, we're going to make some money and not really care about what it had to say. And just forget all that. Just slap a name on it, give it to you, and go. It is a huge shame. Fortunately, we have this movie, and it is still beautiful and wonderful.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It's a delight. So I am telling everyone, we've probably spoiled the film, but it's not the same as seeing it. Mm-mm. It's, I think, required viewing. Whether you're a sci-fi fan, a eco fan, a horror fan, or just a film fan in general, this film is in the criterion, for a reason.
Yes, and you all may have noticed this episode has gone pretty long, and there's still so much more to talk about, so I'm sure either we will broach more topics when we eventually dive into Shin Gojira, or maybe I'm just going to have to bring it up again in another season because it's so rich. There's so much I didn't talk about considering the camera work and the set design, costumes, all of this. It's one thing to hear us talk about it. It's another thing to experience it for yourself. So please, if you can find a copy of it somewhere, if you can find it on streaming, like on HBO Max, check out the original Gojira. I think, though, for now, we can wrap up. What about you?
Yeah, this is a good place to end.
Yeah. In which case, this podcast is a part of the Anatomy of a Scream Pod Squad. So be sure to follow the Anatomy of a Scream podcast page on your preferred podcast platform to check out more introspective, semi-academic, and fun podcasts, including 28 Days Later, hosted by Sophie and Hannah Day, XOXO Horror, and much more. You can find more info at anatomyofascream.com, and please support them. They're the whole reason this podcast exists the way it does today. So you're going to be supporting podcasts as they start and be part of their growth and their audience. And I know that wonderful people working there, and show them your support. If you're interested in more of my musings on beauty and horror, or just horror in general, you can follow me on Twitter, which is @_Shockaholic, and you can find my website, which is shockaholic.org. So, dear listeners, what are your thoughts on Gojira? I would love to hear about them on Twitter @BeautyHorrorPod, via email, which is beautyofhorrorpod@gmail.com, or in the community space of our Discord, which you can find a link to on the Twitter page. I want to thank you again, Dani, for sitting down and having such a meaningful and thorough conversation about one of my all-time favorite films. Where can everyone find you, and what do you have going on that you'd like to plug right now?
Awesome. You can find me on Twitter only. That's the only social media I have, people. So you can find me where the horror resides, at the Dani Bethea, TheDaniBethea, on Twitter. And I'm currently working on some projects. I don't know if I should say what they are, but you can find me very soon in a collection called The Women of Genji Kohan that delves into some of her work. I did a piece in there about Orange is the New Black, and about the Black queer characters in the film and how they impacted the rest of the series going forward as far as viewership. I don't want to spoil any more than that, but that's a must read. I've got some big things cooking. I'm trying not to unveil what they are. So I'm always up to something, and a lot of times I just can't say until it happens. So I guess I can't say any more than that, because I will be involved in some things that I will let everyone know about. So just stay tuned, okay?
So you've got to go to their social media on Twitter to keep an eye on these things. And I'm going to echo Dani here. When Dani says something is a must-read, it is more of a must-read than most things ever, but also everything Dani writes is a must-read. So please check out Dani's work. You will not be disappointed. And I'm very excited about reading that thing about Orange is the New Black, because yes, the topic that appeals to me very much. That is a topic for another podcast, I suppose, but all exciting things. Can't wait to see what you've got next. And thank you, dear listener, for joining us and talking about the beauty that lurks within the horrible. Goodbye.
There's no